Colonialism. So let's start with what colonialism means. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. In the most simplest explanation, colonialism or colonization is when one nation goes to another nation and claims its land as its own. They bring their people, then for example, if that country has resources like gold or oil, they would start taking its resources, which I suppose technically are now their resources. Does that make sense? Okay. So colonialism, it goes all the way back to ancient civilizations. The Egyptians practiced it, the Greeks practiced it, the Romans for sure were great at it, and it was actually quite common. Now, colonialism, in the sense that I'm referring to it, is often referred to as the Age of Discovery. And it was called this because explorers predominantly from Europe set out on their ships to explore the Americas, the coasts of Africa, the Middle East, India, and East Asia. At this time, the Portuguese and the Spanish were the forerunners. They were the first people to have empires that had colonies on different continents, but they also spanned the globe. So the Spanish had colonized parts of North and South America, Europe, obviously, and some islands in the South Pacific. Similarly, the Portuguese had colonized parts of South America, Africa, and Asia. Europe too, obviously. So at the time, Spain and Portugal, they were quite a big deal. Here you can see at the top left is what the Portuguese Empire looked like at its peak. You can see the parts of South America that we now know today as Brazil. Portuguese is still the official language in Brazil, and a lot of these ex-colonies still speak the language. Angola, Cabo Verde, Mozambique, they all have souvenirs of colonialism. Then, on the bottom right, you have the Spanish Empire at its peak. So South America, that looks a bit like Argentina, Montevideo, Paraguay. Then you have Colombia up north, Venezuela, Mexico, and a lot of the west of America, which at the time was native land and was actually part of what today we now know as Mexico. Around the Caribbean, we have Cuba, Hispaniola, which now we know today as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And then you can see some of the Leeward and Windward Islands are there too. Then Africa, I think that looks a bit like Morocco and the Western Sahara. And then Asia looks like Vietnam and the Philippines and a bunch of little islands around thereabouts. It's not exact. I don't have a map to compare, but that's just a guess and based on the languages that are still spoken in these regions. And there are the flags of the empire. Portugal at the top right, Spain at the bottom left. If you've ever played the game Assassin's Creed Black Flag, you would recognise the Spanish one. So let's look at colonialism in America. I guess you could say this quote-unquote modern era of colonialism that I'm talking about starts with a man named Christopher Columbus. You've probably heard of him as he's credited as one of the most influential and famous contributors to the Age of Discovery. If you haven't heard of him, I'll explain a little bit. So Christopher Columbus wanted to go to the East Indies, or India as we now know it, because there was a lot of money to be made trading spices. But Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain said that they would sponsor him to go on an exploration trip to the West, in the name of the Crown of Castile, of course. In short, whatever he finds, he claims for Spain. First he lands on the Bahamas, then he went to Cuba, then Hispaniola. And I'm pretty sure he established a colony on what is now Haiti, and the French later took it from Spain. Anyway, he went back to Spain and brought a bunch of the natives that he had captured. I think he made 4 voyages in total, and by the end he had landed on most of the Caribbean islands. He was responsible for the genocide of many indigenous people. In fact, he almost single-handedly wiped out the Taino people in the Americas. Okay, back to the slide. Christopher Columbus quote-unquote discovers America, even though a Viking explorer called Leif Erikson discovered it 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born, and there were already indigenous people occupying the land when he arrived. Forward 95 years, and Walter Raleigh established a short-lived Roanoke colony in North Carolina. Then, about 25 years after that, Pilgrims and Puritans from England and Holland are moving to America to establish their own colonies because they had religious differences with the Church of England. They hopped on a ship called the Mayflower and they sailed from Southampton to Nauset, which is in modern-day Massachusetts. Nauset was inhabited by the Nauset people. When the Pilgrims went to explore, the native people understandably ran away. The local native tribe were already familiar with the English because they had intermittently visited the area for fishing and trade before the Mayflower arrived. In the Cape Cod area, though, relations between the natives and the English was quite tense because on one of the many visits by the English several years earlier, a man named Thomas Hunt kidnapped 20 people from the Patuxet tribe and another 7 natives from the Nauset tribe, and he had attempted to sell them as slaves back in Europe. One of the Patuxet abductees was a Native American man named Squanto, and Squanto actually later became an ally of the Plymouth colony. Numerous diseases were brought to the Americas and introduced by the Europeans. This included smallpox, bubonic plague, chickenpox, cholera, the common cold, diphtheria, influenza, malaria, measles, scarlet fever, typhoid, typhus, tuberculosis, whooping cough, and sexually transmitted diseases. In order for the colonies to expand and grow, new land had to be acquired. Understandably, the natives didn't want to part with their land. However, the English had strength in numbers and weapons. The natives were fighting with handcrafted weapons such as bows, arrows, and knives. Meanwhile, the British had guns and swords. Thanksgiving in America is celebrated every year on the 4th Thursday of November and commemorates the founding fathers who colonized America. Okay, 1606. A Dutchman named Willem Janszoon lands on Australia. Janszoon works for the Dutch East India Company, which was a trading company and, as the name suggests, ran trade between Holland and India. The Dutch explored Australia in search of gold, and they named it New Holland. 1770. Along comes a British lieutenant, James Cook. He left Britain for Australia with the sole purpose of charting it for colonisation, specifically a penal colony. About 18 years later, the first fleet of ships from Britain to Australia head for Botany Bay in the southeast. They established their penal colony, and in the 80 years that follow, about 162,000 convicts were transported from Britain and Ireland to various penal colonies in Australia. Actually, the British government began transporting convicts overseas to American colonies in the early 17th century, so shipping their convicts elsewhere wasn't a new concept for the British. And I believe it only ended because the American Revolution started. So, the Europeans were well and truly making themselves at home in New Holland, but what about the indigenous? What about the Aboriginals? Well, they were detrimentally affected, like the American indigenous tribes, by the introduction of new diseases brought by the Europeans. The Aboriginals, they tried to fight off the Europeans. They tried to hold on to their land, but as in America, they were outnumbered and had inferior weapons. So ultimately, lost. 1642, and we have another Dutchman, this time Abel Tasman. He lands on New Zealand. Abel Tasman, like Willem Janszoon, also worked for the Dutch East India Company. There were already indigenous Polynesian people living on the land, the Maori people. They arrived in what we now call New Zealand around 300 years before Tasman. It was actually a Dutch mapmaker who named New Zealand, and it got its name from Zeeland, which is a region in Holland. You'll notice a lot of the colonies are given names of places from the country that's colonising them. Side note, generally places that are called New something probably have colonial roots. So New Zealand, New Hampshire in America, New York, which was New Amsterdam before when the Dutch first named it, and the British then renamed it New York. New South Wales in Australia, they're just some examples. So, 1769, James Cook arrives, presumably before he hopped over to Australia to chart it for its penal colony. Then, from the late 18th century, New Zealand was regularly visited. Many of its visitors were traders, but there were also missionaries, there were explorers, adventurers, sailors, possibly using it as a stopgap on their trade routes. In 1840, a treaty was drawn up. A treaty is an agreement usually between countries, states, or even tribes. So in 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the Maori chiefs and representatives from Great Britain. This treaty brought New Zealand into the British Empire and recognised the Maori as British subjects, meaning that they had the same rights as other Brits. A few years pass after the treaty is signed, and the British want to expand, so they want Maori land. And they feel like they're entitled to it because New Zealand is now part of the British Empire. But the Maori people dispute this, and the differing translations of the treaty are blamed for the confusion. Then in 1843, the New Zealand Wars start. At the peak of hostilities around the 1860s, 18,000 British troops supported by artillery, cavalry, and local militia fought around 4,000 Maori warriors. Again, as in America against the Native Americans and in Australia against the Aboriginals, there was a huge imbalance of manpower and weaponry. The Maori used guerrilla tactics and were actually able to do a lot of damage to the British troops, but ultimately the war and the imposition of the European economic and legal system meant that eventually the vast majority of land in New Zealand passed from Maori to British ownership. The consequence of this being the Maori were left poor, both in resources, land, and financially. Fact: the term Maori did not exist until the Europeans arrived. It means ordinary, and Maori used it to distinguish themselves from the new fair-skinned European settlers. Now we move on to the West Indies. I will use West Indies and Caribbean interchangeably, but I'm referring to the same place, geographically located in between North and South America and around the Caribbean Sea. So, 1492, back to our dear friend Christopher discovering the Americas. As we learned in an earlier slide, he claimed the majority of the region for the Crown of Castile, so for the Spanish. Broadly speaking, Taino and Arawaks refer to the same indigenous peoples. The Caribs, sometimes referred to as the Kalinago, at the time of the Spanish arrival, Caribs were one of the dominant groups in the Caribbean. They mostly lived in northeastern South America, the Windward Islands, and possibly some of the southern Leeward Islands. The Taino lived more in the North Caribbean, so the Greater Antilles, the islands of Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Bahamas. They also lived in some islands in the northern Lesser Antilles. So historically, we know Christopher Columbus used violence and slavery. We know he forced conversion of native peoples to Christianity, and we know he introduced a host of new diseases that would have dramatic long-term effects on the native people in the Americas. Christopher Columbus lived at a time when the international slave trade was starting to grow, so Columbus and his men enslaved many native inhabitants of the West Indies and subjected them to extreme violence and brutality. In fact, it states in his diary that on his first day in the New World, he ordered 6 of the natives to be seized and that he believed they would be good servants. Columbus enacted policies of forced labour in which natives were put to work for the sake of profits. Later, Columbus sent thousands of peaceful Taino people from the island of Hispaniola to Spain to be sold. Many didn't survive the journey. Those left behind were forced to search for gold in mines and work on plantations. Within the 60 years after Columbus landed, only a few hundred of what may have been 250,000 Taino were left on their island. As governor of the Indies, appointed by Spain, according to documents discovered by Spanish historians in 2005, Columbus imposed strict discipline on what is now the Dominican Republic. In response to native unrest and revolt, Columbus ordered a brutal crackdown in which many natives were killed. Then, in an attempt to deter future rebellion, Columbus ordered their dismembered bodies to be paraded through the streets. In America, every second Monday in October is a national holiday commemorating Christopher Columbus. So, now we have an idea of Christopher Columbus and his practices, let's fast forward to 1623, when the West Indian colonisation by the British began. It started on a small leeward island called St. Christopher, but better known as St. Kitts. St. Kitts was populated by both Caribs and Arawaks. The Spanish and French had tried to settle there unsuccessfully before the British in 1623. A man named Thomas Warner had made several trips around the West Indies to different islands and decided St. Kitts would be best suited for a British colony. He noted its strategic central position ideal for expansion, friendly native population, fertile soil, abundant fresh water, and large salt deposits. He and his family landed on the island and made peace with the local Carib people. In 1625, the French arrived on St. Kitts, also looking to set up a colony, so the French and British split the island. Warner left his family on the island and returned to England to gather more men to officially establish a colony. In August 1626, he returned with over 100 more English settlers, enslaved Africans, and provisions. The fact that he had Africans with him shows that the English wanted to develop the island as a plantation colony and had realised that the Caribs were not likely to be good labourers. The Caribs became suspicious by the increase in numbers and the number of structures being built. The Caribs requested help from allies on other islands and were preparing to go to war when Warner and his men attacked them. The chief was killed and many other Caribs slaughtered in what is known as the Bloody Point Massacre. On St. Kitts there is a river named Bloody River because it is said they killed so many natives the river ran red with their blood. A few Caribs survived, and their presence continued on the island until the end of the century, but their numbers were insignificant, and the island became a European plantation colony as first envisaged by the Europeans who took it from the Caribs. It's worth mentioning, despite being married with a son, Thomas Warner also had a Carib mistress in St. Kitts. They had a son together named Indian Warner. As you can see on this slide, the English and French set to work colonising many islands, souvenirs of which are still visible throughout the islands and can also be heard in their language and the island dialects. Beginning in the 1620s and 1630s, non-Hispanic privateers, traders and settlers established permanent colonies and trading posts on the islands neglected by Spain. Such colonies spread throughout the Caribbean, from the Bahamas in the northwest to Tobago in the southeast. In addition, beginning in the 1620s, French and English buccaneers settled in places like the island of Tortuga, the northern and western coast of Hispaniola, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and later Jamaica. So, in short, the islands that Spain had not colonised were quickly snatched up by the French and the British, and they established permanent colonies. Which brings us to the British Empire. As we've learned from the previous slides, we know the British were steady building their empire. They had colonies on every continent. In 1908, they even claimed territory in Antarctica. They started small, establishing trading posts and then later possessions such as New Zealand. At its peak, it was the largest empire in history, and for over 100 years, it was a superpower. It had power over 412 million subjects and spanned 24% of the total land area on the planet. This domination meant that its political impact, its language, its legislation, and its cultural legacy is very widespread. As you can see on the map on the right, the areas highlighted in pink show the areas considered the British Empire. Let's quickly recap. During the Age of Discovery, many Europeans travelled around the globe in search of new places. All of the places that were quote-unquote discovered already had their own indigenous people living on those lands. Europeans took land that belonged to the indigenous peoples and settled on it, exploiting the resources of the region. Europeans brought diseases to indigenous communities. Europeans slaughtered indigenous peoples. Europeans took indigenous people from their native land to trade, and at the height of the British Empire, it occupied almost a quarter of the globe.